Hello, everyone. I don't know. Do I need a microphone?
No.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first PRC Brown Bag of Fall 2022. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Brea Perry. Dr. Perry is a Vice Provost and an Associate Vice President for Research and L&D and Polly Scrimshaw Professor of Sociology in Indiana University, Bloomington. Her research focuses on social networks, biomarkers, social psychology, and social inequality in health and illness, with a particular focus on mental health and substance use disorders. She is interested in longitudinal research, dynamic social processes, and quantitative methods. Her work utilized social network analysis on a variety of issues, including mental health, mental illness, and aging processes. Her research gained support and recognition from National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institute on Aging, among others. Her work has been published in a wide array of sociological and interdisciplinary journals, including American Journal of Sociology, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Social Science and Medicine, and Sociology of Health and Illness, among esteemed others. She confesses on her bio that she's not a fond of Twitter, yet she feels compelled to be in, and also that she's an ice cream enthusiast. Before we welcome Dr. Perry, I want to remind the structure of the PRC seminars. Upon completion of Dr. Perry's presentation, a Q&A session will begin, and the first two questions are reserved for graduate students. Today's talk is sponsored by PRC and CAP, Center on Aging and Population Sciences. Please join me in giving Dr. Perry a warm welcome to present Aging and the Social Brain, the role of social networks in Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Yes. I'm gonna actually have to try to be quiet because with a microphone, I'm like a little bit obnoxious. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really, really excited about this audience because there are so many people that are like in my wheelhouse. And normally when I start talking about brains and stuff, people are like, you know, they like start to go to sleep a little bit, but I feel like I'm gonna get some really good questions and feedback. So thank you so much for having me. Something going wrong.
You need to enable it. I'm disabled. He wants to share the screen with everyone.
Oh,
You can go ahead.
they don't want to see Edwin?
No.
I don't know why. He seems like a perfectly nice person. So I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I've been doing for about 5 years. That's funded by NIA. Oh, okay. Well, whoop. No. Oh wait. Okay, it's probably just not turned on. Wait. Okay, I need help. Sorry.
Go ahead. Try it now.
Yes. Okay. All right. So I had never really studied social neuroscience or the brain before, but a sort of through line in my research is social networks, right? And particularly egocentric social networks. And so I read a couple of articles, you know, and I don't know, maybe like about a decade ago, maybe a little less, that really piqued my interest in sort of brains and brain changes and how those might be related to social experiences. One of them was this article on online social network size, which is reflected in human brain structure. So the bigger your Facebook network, the larger some of the areas of your brain that are associated with social processing. And I thought that was super interesting. And then of course, you know, there are reverse causation issues there, but then there's all this research in these rhesus macaques who are just like incredibly adorable. I really should have been a primatologist. I missed the mark there. But suggesting that social network size affects not just sort of the structure of your brain or how like fat and plump it is, but also like how interconnected it is, sort of brain networks themselves. And you can do this research prospectively. You know, you can't change social network size in humans, but you can in these macaques. You can change their number of cage mates, you can change their hierarchy in the social structure, and all this cool stuff happens to their brain after you change their social environment. So that just got me super interested in this. And then, you know, you have to get your research funded, which is just like an unfortunate, you know, side effect of like wanting to do cool research. And so I started getting into the research on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. You all know a lot about this, so I could probably just even skip this slide, but essentially it's this progressive aging-related disease. Tons of people have it with the aging population structure. More and more people are going to have it, so you know people are concerned about it. So it seemed like a good inroad into this area of research. Interestingly, you know, we've since sort of found out that everything that we thought caused ADRD pathology, like these plaques and tangles in the brain, may just be sort of an effect. This is like magically going forward. And so that's really interesting to me to think about, like the fact that all these neuroscientists have been studying this for decades and probably like just totally going down the wrong direction, which makes me feel really special about being a sociologist. So what we do know about sort of this area of research, social connectedness and ADRD, is that there's this really strong link between older adults' social connectedness, like very heterogeneously measured, right? I mean, it's all over the board, as I'll show you in a minute. And the onset and course of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, right? So not just whether you get it at all, but what's the trajectory of cognitive decline once you have it? That is related to lots of social factors. And so there's good evidence on this. Like there's prospective longitudinal evidence over decades. We've known this for a while. There's even like 4 or 5 meta-analyses now that are really good. And that's when I feel like, okay, something is real. However, although there's all this, this research about a relationship existing, the social and biological mechanisms that are underlying this relationship are really unclear and contested. Part of this, I think, is because there's sort of a lack of unifying theory about what it is about social interaction or social networks or social support or whatever that's actually driving changes in the brain and therefore changes in cognition. And then there's also just like a ton of measurement heterogeneity and real like imprecision. I mean, I'm just going to boil it down to just really crappy measures of the social environment. And this is in large part because, you know, this research is often not like the central thing that these neurologists or geneticists or whatever are studying. It's like, you know, one thing out of many. And so they just put on like whatever the crappiest, like shortest measure. And I get that because I get the like, you know, constraints of respondent burden and so forth. But so it's all over the board and nobody has really like taken stock of this measurement and what you are actually getting, right? What these measures are actually operationalizing in terms of what is, I'm telling you, like every like minute it just goes forward. It's like you need to move forward with your talk. You're talking too long, move it along. So apologies for the back and forth on the slides. But literally everything from number of relationships, which we know is kind of a crappy measure. It can really literally mean almost anything. How often you're having social contact, social support, social activities, subjective loneliness, marital status, all these things without a lot of theorizing about what the engine of action is. Like, what's the social engine of action? So then I got really excited about, okay, let me think about what do I know about social theory, right? And oh, I'm telling you, watch, I'm gonna put this down and it's gonna keep going. That's fine. I want to be on this slide anyway. So what do we know about sort of the way that humans interact, theories of social networks, and what those social networks or those measures of social networks bring to you? What are the benefits that they have? And how can we pair that with what we know about neuropathology and neurological theories of ADRD? And so, of course, you know, the first sort of theory that I thought could be potentially relevant is social bridging, which I use as kind of an umbrella term to describe, you know, the strength, Granovetter's strength of weak ties, right? The Burt structural holes, bridging social capital from Coleman, and this idea that essentially having sort of diverse, weak, large number of loosely connected ties brings you, typically in sociology, when we study it, it's like novel information, right? Or power within your social network. And so is there something that we're getting from this sort of social bridging that might be beneficial for see, I told you, I don't know what's happening. Okay, but like weirdly, I wanted to move on. So well, I don't know what you guys have going on here, but a little weird. Yeah, so this theory actually of social bridging pairs really, really nicely with a prominent theory of ADRD resilience called cognitive reserve. And the idea is that you have these enrichment experiences, and typically they thought about these enrichment experiences pretty broadly, right? So it's by no means just social types of enrichment. It's all kinds of enrichment, crossword puzzles, right? Like, you know, a while back, the AARP was like, you all need to be doing crossword puzzles, right? So that's the sort of theory that they're tapping into. And that these provide a reserve against neurodegeneration. And they're not exactly sure how it works. It potentially, like, you have a big, fat, like plumpen, interconnected brain before the neurodegeneration sets in. And so then there are all these alternative pathways that your brain can work through. And so your cognition stays better for longer, despite your brain being kind of a mess in there. And then, the other idea is that, well, maybe your brain is actually responding to the pathology and able to build sort of new connections to work around the pathology after the pathology sets in. And so we don't really know exactly how it works, but it's really cool to think about sort of how this looks in terms of comparing what the brain looks like inside your head compared to what your sort of outward cognitive abilities and cognitive performance is. So like these are some pictures of amyloid positivity. And so the red and orange is bad, right? So if you have that, you have lots of amyloids, which may be a cause of ADRD or maybe a symptom of ADRD. We don't really know. But either way, it's one of the most prominent ways that you actually diagnose ADRD versus some other kind of dementia. And so we have on the left here someone who's amyloid positive and they have Alzheimer's disease, which means that they also have cognitive signs and symptoms of cognitive decline, right? And then you have someone in the middle here who's amyloid positive, right? They have all this neurodegeneration in their brain, but they're completely cognitively normal. Over here, you have someone who's amyloid negative and normal, right? Sort of the control. These people are the people that have cognitive reserve, right? So this is like a really common situation where you have someone whose brain looks really bad. If you were to just take a picture of the brain, looking at structural measures, functional MRI, whatever, right? It doesn't look good, but then on outward, they have no symptoms essentially. So that I think pairs really well with this idea of social bridging, because it could be that interacting in networks that are really diverse, where you're seeing different faces, talking to different people, getting in different kinds of information and ideas, might actually build this cognitive reserve, much like occupational complexity and education do. And there's like pretty good research on those areas. So I thought that was a good fit. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's going to let me control it. The other possible pathway that sort of leapt out at me is through social bonding, right? So this is, all your Durkheimian social integration, bonding social capital, perceptions of social support, feeling that you're a valued part of a group. And we know that, these have a number of downstream, and this you guys know very, very well. Stress buffering, these have a lot of downstream effects on neuroendocrine regulation, inflammation, things that we know also cause Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, right? So it could be that if you're interacting in this network that's densely connected, that's highly supportive, strong networks, that would either buffer the effects of stress on the body, or would even affect your sort of baseline oxytocin or basal cortisol levels or whatever, that would result in less neuroinflammation and better ADRD outcomes. So it could be that these bonding networks are what really matters, right? So this is sort of where I started, was trying to understand what kind of networks matter and why, what might be the biological mechanisms underlying this. So I'm going to tell you today about what I think I know, right? And you guys can correct me, ask all the questions, but this is sort of from a lot of different studies where we think that the sort of action is. So I've been collecting, okay, I'm going to leave it alone. I've been collecting network data on an Alzheimer's Disease Research Center cohort of older adults for about 6 years. There are about 450 of them, and there's this P30 ADRC, and they have this really amazing cohort where they're already collecting all this clinical cognitive data. Like it's a dream, right? All the things that I get from this cohort. And then they have things like consensus diagnosis, where they get all these clinicians together in a room and they all decide together whether this person has mild cognitive impairment or ADRD, and then neuroimaging data. So not only structural MRI, but also functional MRI, where we get to look at sort of brain networks, PET scans, even like lumbar punctures, which grosses me out. So I haven't done anything with that yet, but the data are there, right? So lots of cool biomarkers and cognitive data. So what we did is we came in and we added social network data. And so this cohort is about 50% cognitively normal, but all of them are sort of at high risk for ADRD. Either they're like advanced age, or they have 2 copies of the E4, ApoE allele, or they have familial dementia, right? And so the benefit of this is that you can see actually people transitioning from normal to MCI to ADRD, and understanding sort of as that's happening, what are the factors that are causing this. So our cohort is about 25% mild cognitive impairment, and then 25% early stage AD. And these are the demographic characteristics. So what we do is we go into their homes and we use, not surprisingly, egocentric or personal social network methodology. And that allows us to really disaggregate very distinct, sort of precise measures of the social environment. Like what is actually causing this, right? Because we can use these to create measures that like very clearly tap into either social bridging or social bonding, or even things like social influence or social stress, right? So we're using this method, even though it's really intensive, to be able to understand what those social mechanisms really are. So the way that we do this is that we elicit the names of people in the respondents' networks. These are called alters. And then we follow up with name interpreter questions where we're asking a series of questions about everybody in the network. And then we determine how those alters are connected to one another. And if you're interested in getting into this area of research, we use the, what's it called? New software out of Northwestern. Oh, okay, email me if you want to use it because it's amazing. So it makes collecting ego network data, see? Super easy. And it's computer like this, and people can literally just like draw lines between their ties and they can bin information about the ties, and it's super awesome. I'm really excited about it. Okay, so we started out with a phase 1 pilot where, you know, we had a small amount of money to go in and collect sort of limited name generators. And so we sort of focused on, to be perfectly honest, the ones that we knew best, like what we were going to get out of it and what to expect. So it's the modified important matters and health matters discussants. Who do you talk to about important matters? Who can you really trust? Who do you talk to about health? Blah, blah, blah. And so these are essentially core networks, right? So then we have phase 2 R01 that we've been collecting since then, where we're really trying to capture both core and peripheral networks. So not just sort of the people you're closest to, but also the people that are like kind of regularly in your life, but you're not that close to, because we thought, well, maybe that's where a lot of the action actually is, right? Is in these more peripheral interactions. And so in addition to the name generators from the pilot, we also now get family members, coworkers and fellow volunteers, neighbors that they talk to regularly, anyone else who's important, and then the study partner. So that's a whole another thing I could talk about in Q&A. And then we did this, we sort of experimented with elastic ties, which is like everybody that you talk to on this one day that we sort of like plucked out of the week randomly. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but I can in Q&A if you want. So then we can use this network information to create these really precise and informative measures of social mechanisms. So for social bridging, we might be interested in things like network size, network effective size, density, minimum tie strength, which is sort of like, do you have any weak ties in your network? Diversity, which is diversity of social roles, and then homophily, which is sort of more traditional, lack of diversity. And then for social bonding, we can look at things like number of close ties, support multiplexity, frequency of contact, quality of relationships, and we can get all of these very precise data out of these network mechanisms, or network data. And then these are just like the things we control for in almost any analysis, just FYI. So for a lot of the data that I'm going to show you, we look at global cognitive function from the MoCA. This is the MoCA. This is the test that Trump took that he said he passed, did really well on. So literally you can see it's like, you know, it's just a screener for dementia, right? Like it's like, what animal is this? But you know, he did do well, so that's good for him. So in addition to this, which sort of measures lots of different kinds of cognitive domains, we also often use episodic memory, verbal fluency, and executive function, because those are the things that seem to be most related to network outcomes. And then we use these quantitative neuroimaging phenotypes, which is super cool because people who know about brains and know about these measures do this, and then they just give them to me, which is really like the ideal situation. And so they literally take a picture of the brain. This is structural MRI. And then they take out the skull and then they look at sort of the borders around like the cerebral cortex, or they measure like the volume of a particular area, like the amygdala or the hippocampus or whatever. And then they give me those numbers. So you can actually measure how much the brain is atrophying over time, which is, something that happens in ADRD. You're just coming to hang out with me? Okay, cool. Okay. You're gonna give me a new, oh, now it's really, that's way faster than I want. Okay. Let's see what happens. Okay, so what do we find, right? Like, what's related to these neuroimaging phenotypes? What's related to these cognitive measures? This is just sort of an overview of core network characteristics by consensus diagnosis. So on average, if we're looking at only the core networks, and I'll show you later what it looks like with core and peripheral networks, this is what people who are cognitively normal, this is what their network looks like, right? So they have like 2 friends on average. It's dense, but not super, super dense. It's sort of moderately dense. And there's, kind of a mix of kin and friends. And it's about 5 ties on average, which is sort of what you see in like, national studies or these other studies of ego networks. People tend to have about 5 core ties. And then as you sort of go down and, people have these diagnoses, their networks become smaller, more densely connected, and more kin-based. And so this was just sort of like provided a first clue about what might be going on. And so then we can look at, I apologize for numbers, you can really just look at the yellow part. Then we said, okay, well, let's look at these measures of social bridging and social bonding across a sort of variety of measures of cognitive function. And what we find is that measures of social bridging are sort of consistently linked, both sort of cross-sectionally and longitudinally, to cognitive outcomes, whereas social bonding is rarely associated with these cognitive outcomes. And in some cases, it's associated in the opposite way that you would expect. In other words, like having closer networks is not good for your cognition. So this is just sort of the overall pattern of what we're seeing. And then I have this amazing, well, he's now a research scientist, Sayun Peng, who developed this latent bridging factor. So one of the problems with social network analysis is you have tons of measures that are often like highly correlated with each other. So how do you deal with them in regression models? And so he developed this like really good latent bridging factor. And so now we use that in almost every study because we don't have to look at multiple measures. And what we find is that if your bridging score is above the mean, that's strongly associated with the MoCA, which is that sort of general cognitive function. It's associated with okay, you guys have a ghost. This place is haunted. It's associated with the cognitive dementia rating scale, episodic memory, and all sorts of other cognitive indicators. And so this is just sort of a picture of what it looks like if you have high versus low bridging on average. And then if you look at the networks that include both sort of the core and peripheral networks, you see these even larger differences between older adults who are cognitively normal and those who have dementia. So this is with all those name generators included, the folks with dementia still pretty much look like what they looked like when we were only measuring the core networks, right? So this tells you something both about how having sort of limited networks affects ADRD risk, but also there's some reverse causation here. So when we sort of break this down, it seems to be about 70 to 75% going towards like the social causation direction, where your networks are causing outcomes, and the rest is going the opposite way, right? Where of course, as you become more impaired, you lose your ability to maintain these relationships. But just the vast difference between someone who's cognitively normal and someone who has even early stage dementia, which, if you met them on the street, you wouldn't be able to tell there was anything wrong with them. And that's because, in some other work that we're doing, we're finding that sort of social cognition is one of the first things that goes as you become diagnosed. And so that's obviously really problematic if we think that having these sort of weaker ties, opportunities for diverse and enriching interactions is something that maintains cognitive reserve. If social cognition is one of the first sort of things to become impaired, then that's really problematic because you just start to go downhill super fast, unless you have someone, it turns out, who can kind of keep you integrated. And then this is a fun thing that I did recently. And And this is, we're using the whole networks now. And this is where I'm like really trying to dial down, like, what is it about social networks that matter for cognition? The outcome here is the MoCA, so it's sort of general cognitive function. These are average marginal effects. And so if you, I don't know, you can't see the colors super well on here, but basically they're sort of broken down by measures of a particular mechanism. So the one on the left is controls. And then in the blue here, we have like social participation. So like, are you married? Do you have kids? Are you still working? You know, do you go to church? Do you volunteer? Do you use social media? Turns out that doesn't matter at all. None of those things are associated with cognitive function in older adults, which really surprised me. Then over here, you have what I would call social stress. We really need better measures of this. So that's, I know, something. And I can talk about that in Q&A if you want, but this is social loss. So the kind of stuff that Deb studies. And social hassles, right? So is there conflict or just annoyance in your relationships? Neither of those seem to matter. I was really surprised about that. These are all sort of social bonding measures. So quality of relationships across various domains, a sort of overall social integration variable, perceived social support, and then some network measures that we've used before, like percent of close ties, et cetera. Those rarely matter for cognitive function in older adults, with the exception of relationship quality with friends, which I think actually could be a bridging measure, right? And then over here is all of our bridging measures. And what I'm really super excited about, I'm so excited about this, because this is like super new and we really need to dig into it, is that we're finding that homophily in your network is adversely associated with cognitive function. So it's actually better for your brain if you're in a network of people or have access to interactions with people who are not like you. So racial homophily, for example, the more racially homophilous, your network is, the worse your cognitive function on average. Educational homophily, not quite significant, but I think with more data, we'll get there. And then age diversity in your network is really good. And these don't look like big effects, but they're actually big effects. It's just about the range of the variable. So not exactly, it's not, these aren't standardized or anything. So I'm really excited about digging into that and trying to understand what's going on there. Okay. And then the rest of these are just sort of standard social bridging measures that I talked about before, although we have this really cool measure of the number of contacts in their phone, which I love this measure, and it's like highly predictive of cognitive function. And so this is like the first time I looked at it and I got like super excited. So, you know, we'll see after I get out of administration in a year, we'll have maybe some papers coming out about that. So this sort of gives you an idea that social bridging is really driving a lot of this. Right. Here's another piece that is work being done by one of my like absolutely outstanding graduate students, Max Coleman. He is really interested in occupational complexity data. And some of you that study demography probably know that you can break down occupational complexity into complexity of data with things, with people, and with data. And those often if you have like a high data complexity job, it's low complexity with people because you're like, you know, holed up in your office, like doing some techie things. And so if we look at this occupational complexity data across all these different outcomes, including MCI or ADRD diagnosis, we find that occupational complexity across the life course working with people is strongly associated with your outcomes, all these cognitive outcomes, including dementia. Whereas working with data or things is not at all associated with your cognitive function. And to me, that is really telling. It is some really important data for sort of triangulating what we're finding with the networks, right? That it really is, I mean, it's doubtful that you're working with people that you like really know or you're bonded to in your job, right? You're working with strangers. You're like in HR or you know, whatever, and you're just constantly seeing different people having to navigate different social situations, you know, having to interpret social cues that are different from what you're used to. And this confers resilience to ADRD. Okay, so what are the biological mechanisms underlying these effects of social bridging? So working with this just ridiculous undergrad named Mohit Manchella. I don't know. He's like, he's going to be in the National Academy like way before anyone I know is going to be. We've looked at relationships between that latent social bridging measure that I talked about and gray matter density. And so in doing this, we can say, what are the areas of the brain that are lighting up, that are associated with social bridging? And we find, some things that are sort of what you would expect. So we see really strong relationships in the left and right amygdala. And so the amygdala is kind of the social center of the brain. It's where you have sort of the processing of social emotions, especially negative emotions, like fear and sadness. It's also where you sort of process a lot of social information that comes in and then figure out what to do about it. It's involved in like social conditioning often. And then it also plays a role in retention of episodic memory. So that may be why we're seeing a lot of effects on episodic memory outcomes. And then we see some effects in, I don't remember what the area of the brain is called, but it's basically the part of the brain where you're intaking all the information and then deciding what you're going to do about that, right? And then like sending the information out to the rest of your brain. So the idea that that would be, super closely related to social bridging is also really interesting, because that's sort of like something you have to be able to do to manage social situations. And then we've also, to try to sort of really get at this idea of cognitive reserve, where we're actually looking at neurodegeneration and trying to understand if there's a moderation there, we're finding really consistently across pretty much any measure that we look at, that social bridging moderates the relationship between underlying brain atrophy or neurodegeneration and cognitive outcomes. So if you look at, these are just two examples. This is diversity and effective size. So this right here is high diversity or high effective size, which would indicate strong social bridging. There's no relationship between the amount of atrophy in your amygdala or the size of your amygdala and your cognitive outcomes if you have high social bridging. But there's this really strong relationship that is what we would expect, right? That as your brain becomes more atrophied, you have a lower cognitive function in people who have low social bridging. And so this is kind of what we think is happening, right? So the reality is that if you have all this underlying neuropathology, eventually you're going to get ADRD, right? Like eventually it's going to come for you. But what you want is to be in this situation up top where you have high reserve, ideally, or probably one of the strong candidates being that it would be built through strong social bridging. And then you're essentially able to stave off cognitive decline for much longer. And then you sort of fall off a cliff, right? And that's what you want, right? If you have ADRD, you want to die quickly. If you have low cognitive reserve, then you're more in this sort of situation down here, where it's sort of a long drawn out process of cognitive decline that starts earlier in the life course. Another thing that my postdoc Peng came up with is he used this residual method for measuring cognitive reserve, which I think is super cool, where we basically are throwing in here every single measure of structural and functional neurodegeneration that we have, like everything that we have, including things like whether you have amyloid positivity and how much, whether you have tau positivity. So we can throw all these things in one regression model and try to use it to predict your cognitive outcomes, right? And when we do that, we see, a relationship that you would expect. If your brain looks healthier, your cognition is better. But then we can use that residual and say, do you have better cognitive function than we would expect based on what your brain looks like underneath, or is it worse than we would expect? And we can actually use that as a direct measure of cognitive reserve. And so when we do that, we see, unsurprisingly, and sort of in line with everything else, that this is related to social bridging, very strongly related to social bridging, your sort of residual. So again, I'm sort of telling you the same thing using lots of different data and analyses, right? And that thing is that bridging seems to matter, and it seems to be operating through cognitive reserve, right? So I want to talk here briefly, I want to leave time for questions, but about alternative explanations. Okay. So one of the things we wanted to know was, could it be social withdrawal, right? So thinking about reverse causation, because obviously you can't get rid of everything in longitudinal models, right? There's still going to be some reverse causation that could be happening. So what we did here is we looked at the difference in the networks between people who are who have actual sort of objective dementia or low cognitive function, and people who have subjective cognitive decline, and who either do or don't have low cognitive function. What's super interesting is that there are a lot of older adults who think that they're really experiencing dementia. I'm already in this camp. I'm like, oh, it's already happened. I couldn't find my keys, So they have what are called these subjective cognitive complaints. And so those are the people who, we might expect some kind of social withdrawal because there's a lot of stigma associated with ADRD and with sort of declining cognitive function. And so if you think you have dementia, but you actually don't, would you start to socially withdraw? Would socio-emotional selectivity theory start coming into play? And we don't find that at all, actually. We find that social bridging is really only associated, okay, buddy, with actual cognitive decline. It's not associated with thinking you're declining at all, right? And then we've done sort of an extensive study of forgetting, right? So one of the really obvious things is collecting network data is pretty cognitively intensive. And so is it possible that people who are starting to experience symptoms of cognitive decline just don't name more peripheral members of their social network, right? That seems to make total sense. And so what we have done in this study is that every focal respondent has an informant, right, or a study partner. And so that person, if they're married, it's always their spouse, but sometimes if they're not married, it's, a child or a best friend or a sibling or whatever. And so we ask those informants not only about their own social networks. We've not done anything with those data, so if anyone's interested, let me know. But we also ask them about the focal person's network. And so we essentially have kind of a view from two worlds of these networks. And what we find is that there's actually more corroboration or more overlap among people with cognitive impairment. And the reason is because their network is really smaller. And so that other person knows who they're talking to on a daily basis, knows who they're close to, et cetera, right? And so another thing that we find is that uncorroborated alters, right? So alters that the study partner doesn't know about are more likely to be in these larger, less densely connected networks with fewer kin, which makes sense, right? Like my partner doesn't necessarily know like who all I'm interacting with on a daily basis. So we feel pretty good about those findings. Okay, so implications for social mechanisms. What we think is happening here is that social bridging is providing access to novel and diverse social stimuli. And it may not just be working through sort of novel information as we typically think about in the network world. I think it's happening through different attitudes, ideas, values, yes, but also things like visual cues, looking at different kinds of faces, hearing different kinds of accents. So, both visual, verbal stimuli, and then also, the example that I like to use is like, when I hang out with my partner, like we're sitting on the couch, we're probably like, watching, Severance or something, just chilling out and like grunting at each other occasionally. But like that person knows what I'm thinking, right? They know what I'm going to do next, and vice versa. And so it takes very little cognitive effort or work on my part to interact with that person. The same goes for my kids, right? Like I know when they're going to do some like asshole thing, like I can predict it, right? But if I have to talk to you or someone else that I may know, but I don't know well, I'm doing a lot of work, right? That's why when you get done with one of these days of talks, you're like super tired, right? It's because you've done a ton of social work that day. And that I think is the mechanism, right? That's what's making this work is the having to understand and interpret social cues of people that are not almost kind of automatic for you. And then I want to talk real briefly about implications for health disparities, because I know that's something that a lot of you are really interested in. And so what we find here is that there are these neurological benefits of diverse and enriching environments, which I think is really super promising because nothing gets like white people and like rich people to act more than like telling them there's something in their own self-interest, right? So if we can, show people that actually, being in diverse networks is good for you, right? Then, maybe we can actually get some purchase on some of these social policies. And so it's interesting because this really maps on clearly to things like rural and urban differences. So like people in rural areas are much more susceptible to ADRD, racial and ethnic minorities are more susceptible. And so, to me, education, there's huge educational differences. So people of lower SES are much more vulnerable to ADRD. And so could we sort of get some purchase on understanding these disparities by understanding the social worlds that they're embedded in? Okay. And so I sort of developed this, theoretical model and like the various downstream pathways to try to understand how, different types of social mechanisms may be related to these disparities, right, across gender, SES, race, ethnicity, and rurality, and then thinking about some of the downstream biological processes that might be driving these. And so really to date, the only one, oh, no, buddy, come on. To date, the only one that we've really tested is the top one, because we don't have the biomarkers, and I would argue like not the ideal measures for the others. So in terms of where we're going next, it's this, right? To link this more to the disparities and also to sort of round out the rest of this model. We have done a little bit of preliminary stuff on disparities. And so we find, for example, that about 30% of the educational disparity in ADRD is related to or explained by social bridging or mediated by. So that there seems to be something there happening with education. And then same with rural urban disparities. So we're finding that people in rural areas have less access to social bridging potential, and that's in turn related to their ADRD risk and outcomes. And I have another amazing postdoc who just got an R1 to study that. That's Adam Roth. Okay, so sorry, that was kind of a whirlwind since we got a late start, but I want to put up the acknowledgements while I'm answering questions. I could not do this without my absolutely amazing collaborators who are undergraduates all the way up to named full professors. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
First question from a speaker.
Great. I don't think this is a question. I thought of one interesting measurement that could get into this research. Now young people use dating apps, and on dating apps they interact with so many people and with huge diversity.
Yeah.
So maybe that could add in this.
That's super interesting. I think one of the things I want to push the research in this direction is that I'm finding more and more, and this is no surprise to any of you, that all these things are happening over the entire life course, right? So the ways that you're interacting, in midlife and maybe in early life are changing your brain potentially in ways that can affect your risk for dementia, decades down the line. And so thinking about, what's going to happen to the youths, the kids these days, right? Not only with the dating apps, which I think is a really excellent sort of example of this, but also social media in general, the pandemic, right? And the social isolation and the disruption caused, what are going to be the down the road implications of this for sort of this generation? I have no idea, right? I think thinking about that is really interesting. And unfortunately, the way we tend to study things is for short periods of time. So, one of the things we're trying to do is get some of these measures, both the intensive cognitive measures and the network measures among just adults, in midlife through older age, so that we can understand if they're, as we follow them, are there sort of these same sort of changes. But the technology piece is I don't know, I can't think about it. That's for you to solve and to think about. This congratulations, here's a career for you, and a research agenda, because it is super interesting. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. I mean, the talk was really interesting. I'm Kylie.
Thanks.
I'm a first year student.
Hi, Kylie.
I mean, the explanation that you provided for why social bridging is maybe the cause for like higher cognitive activities was really interesting. So I was wondering if you guys have any further follow-up studies planned to find out, kind of to prove or confirm the explanation. Maybe like experiments or like qualitative interviews or stuff like that.
Yeah. So I think qualitative work is really important. That is not a skill that I have. And I also find that it requires a lot of patience, whereas I want like an instantaneous answer to my question. I have like no patience. So probably will not go down that route. But I do think that there are some interventions and sort of ways of sort of using RCT to understand if in fact this is a viable mechanism, and if we could then like turn these insights into, interventions for older adults. And one of the like really promising directions that I know of is I have this colleague who's here in California, I think at USC maybe. Her name is Hiroko Dodge. She's amazing. You know her? Oh, she's so great. Where is she at USC?
I think so. I think she moved there.
Yeah. Wonderful. She called me like, I don't know, maybe like 3 years ago. And she was like, hey, I know you do social networks. I think there's something here. So I'm going to do this intervention. I'm going to pilot this intervention where I have my grad students call up older adults, talk to them. I can't remember the interval, once or a few times a week for like 30 minutes. And, they're not going to know each other. It might be a different student every time. But I'm going to just try this and see if there's anything there. And my thought was, there's no way this is going to work, right? Like, there's just no way. Like, I don't know. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Well, fast forward, and she now has sort of preliminary results from an RCT, and it freaking works like really well. Like, it's a really strong effect size. So to me, this is just sort of like triangulating more information. And so what I would like to do is either partner with her or someone else who does intervention studies or, implementation or something, and try to figure out, can we build upon what she's done, using these sort of insights about bridging, and then incorporate a neuroimaging sort of component to it so we can actually see if we're seeing, changes in the brain. I don't know, but I think it's an exciting way to think about going. Yeah.
Someone on the chat asked, would you be able to share the software or platform you use to collect social network data
Yes.
from study participants?
I could. See, I'm telling you, I have subjective cognitive decline.
Someone said, is it network canvas?
Yes. Oh. Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yes, it is network canvas. It is amazing. And it's Michelle Burkett, if any of you know her, is like the person behind this, and she is a genius. And the software is free, you guys, it's free. And if you know somebody that knows technology, they can go in there and mess with it and change it. I think it's called open source or something. I'm not techie. And we did that, and we added like longitudinal capabilities, and it's amazing. So you guys should all use it.
Yeah, I think that was fascinating. And this is based on an N1, my mother, but I'm thinking about the pandemic. Like, have you used that as you have data that I mean, were you able to see the effect? Because their world, I mean, everybody's world shrunk.
Yeah.
Kids, old people are, across the life course, but especially older people. And do you see that sort of dropping off that you talked about, that piece, like it happens so quickly? And is there data that suggests that is so?
Yes. Yes. So we had this like state representative survey in the field. And then we like immediately with COVID started asking all these like follow-ups, since we have like every 6 months COVID follow-up. So we know like how networks changed across the pandemic, both for like a whole sample of like 3,000 people of every age. And then we actually fielded the same COVID survey in these older adults. Yes, networks got smaller. What's really interesting though is it's not sort of like the I have a paper title. It's like social isolation or social revival, and then colon some other more scientific thing, as sociology papers tend to be named. So it's like written in my mind, but I haven't written it yet. Where there was sort of a drop off in the sort of types of interactions. There was like less diversity of types of interactions, but like people built these pods. So there really is like and it was like often with like your neighbors, right? Or your like your kids' friends or something. So it's kind of unexpected, like who you built these like pods with. But people just sort of found a way to get their social needs met. There's a huge increase in use of technology to stay connected, especially among older adults. And so they were using a lot of like FaceTime and things, to interact more with their kids. So yes, there were changes. Oh, another thing we saw is a huge uptick in helping and being helped. All this like made me feel really kind of warm and fuzzy and like good about humanity at a time that otherwise has been like really kind of a shit show. So that's good, right? And I think it's all good. What I don't know is whether those changes in interactions, which are sort of towards more of a bonding side of things, like whether that's going to have long-term with neurological outcomes. So we have the data on the adults. There is variation because there were some like Trumpers in there who were like, oh, I go out and do all the things. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say political things like that, but so we do have variation among older adults, and so we can look and see, well, what happened to their, to their brain function or brain structure later on down the road. We don't have enough neurological data to do it because they only get scanned once a year. But I think in the coming years, that'll be, something that we study, that'll be a paper we do. Yeah.
So I think this is super fascinating.
Thanks.
You've been dealing with neurodegeneration. At some point, you're probably going to connect with neurodevelopment. Okay, so I'm thinking about the issues of children in isolation, small children. And I know that we have a lot of information. I mean, I don't think most people know that the brain structure is the only malleable biological structure that can change after birth.
Yeah,
right?
I know, it's amazing.
It's amazing. But during childhood, and especially early childhood, they have synaptic explosions and then pruning and a variety of things that are going on. And they've got a lot of information, I think. I don't know how much they're doing on brain scans for children. It'd be worth exploring that.
Yeah.
Just to see the kind of parallels in terms of neurodevelopment with the neurodegeneration at some point.
Yeah.
So when you expand your empire,
Oh,
but I think it's a fascinating because you do have this establishment of cognitive reserve.
Yes.
So that you get to a level at which you eventually will be declining from.
yes.
So anyway, just it's something I was fascinated when we were talking about this.
I would love to look at that. I've never really done a lot of research on kids per se, so that would be very new to me. That said, I don't like shy away from new areas of research. So, but if you want to collaborate or somebody else, that's really how you have to do it, right? If you're going to if you're going to get into a totally new area, just for you graduate students out there, right? Got to keep a through line. You got your thing that you know about, you're an expert in, and then you pair with other people who are experts in their thing, and hopefully they're not jerks, right? Which definitely not the case. But yeah, no, I totally get it. I see the implications, and just ACEs and like all the things, that affect brain development. Oh, it's just like fascinating. And it changes so fast in kids. So
I think this is a great segue to providing advice to the grad students. So the grad students are going to meet with you for cookies and your sage advice.
I love
And,
cookies.
thanks again for this awesome talk.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.